Hello and welcome to Securing Your Microsoft Ecosystem with Veeam, Windows, Azure, and Microsoft 365. Today's webinar is sponsored by Veeam and produced by Actual Tech Media. My name is Scott Becker. I'm from Actual Tech Media, and I am excited to be your moderator for this special event. Now, before we get to today's timely content, we do have a few housekeeping items that will help you get the most out of this session. First off, we want this to be an informative event for you, so we encourage any questions in the questions box in our webinar control panel. Not only will we have team members responding to questions during the live event, we'll also have a dedicated Q&A session at the end of the presentation where we'll discuss in greater detail some of the top questions that you ask. The Q&A panel is also the place to let us know about any technical issues that you might be experiencing. A browser refresh is going to fix most audio, video, or slide advancement issues, but if that doesn't work, just let us know there in the Q&A and we will provide further technical assistance. Second, in this handout section of your webinar control panel, you'll find that we're offering several resources, and I'd especially like to call your attention to 4 of those from Veeam. There's an Azure Backup Solution Buyer's Guide. There's an 11 Best Practices item from 2 Microsoft MVPs on Azure Backup. There's one about 6 ways to protect data in Azure, and there's a link to sign up for a free consultation about easily protecting and managing all your Azure data. So you can check out those links now or access them at any time during today's webinar. Now, third, at the end of this webinar event, we will be awarding a $250 Amazon gift card to one lucky registrant. And of course, you must be in attendance during the live event to qualify for that prize. The official terms and conditions of today's prize drawing can be found in the handout section as well. Just scroll to the bottom and you'll find the terms and conditions link there. Now, finally, one of the best benefits of this event is the opportunity to ask a question of our expert presenters. We've got 2 great presenters today. They're both quick on their feet and hoping to address as many questions as possible. So to help encourage your questions, we have a special additional prize for you. That's another Amazon gift card, this one for $50 for the best question. So after the event is over, we'll look at all the questions that came in, pick out a great one, and contact that prize winner. And with that, let's get to today's fantastic content. It is my pleasure to introduce you to our presenters today. We have Leah Troshanecki, who's Principal Product Marketing Manager for Public Cloud at Veeam. And we have Sebastian Onofray, who's Senior Inside System Engineer for Public Cloud Solutions at Veeam. So Leah and Sebastian, welcome. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much, Scott. You have an easier name to say than we do, so I'm very jealous.
Yeah.
Oh my goodness.
Take it away, Leah.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Well, let's go ahead and get into it. So once again, thank you all so much for joining us. I know that, so much of our content that we consume today is digital. So I know you guys have a lot of time commitments. We really appreciate the time. And we hope that this is a really beneficial presentation for you all. As Scott said, we really would love to chat with you guys in the Q&A function. So please be sure to drop your questions in because we are really going to span a tremendous amount of story around the Microsoft ecosystem of solutions. Microsoft, of course, is such a lifeblood of so many of our infrastructures and our applications that we interact with. And as so many changes happen to resiliency threats and thinking about all of the threat vectors that we have to deal with as workloads are rapidly moving to cloud and refactoring from IaaS to PaaS, or maybe even deploying brand new SaaS deployments. There's just a tremendous amount of change. And sometimes it's nice to take a step back, take a look at the big picture and see, okay, what do I need to do as a health check to make sure that we're really optimizing these Microsoft investments and keeping our businesses still up and running. So that's what we're hoping to do with this conversation today, is to really do some of that health check work. And in particular, take a look at the breadth of coverage that you might want to consider across data centers, the Microsoft Azure cloud, including containerized offerings, infrastructure as a service, platform as a service, and of course, the Microsoft 365 suite of solutions. They're such a huge part of so many of our environments. But to do that, let's do some stage setting. Veeam is very fortunate that we have tremendous relationships with a lot of analyst firms. And as a result, we end up commissioning a lot of third-party research to really try to better understand the needs of all of the businesses that we work with around the world, and to especially keep updated on that pulse, because we even find tremendous changes year over year when we ask some of these same questions. So we're trying to figure out, how do we increase the frequency of our survey data? How can we really keep a better pulse on, what's going on with these organizations? So hopefully we can impart some of that wisdom onto you all. So kind of three sort of top of mind macro level trends that we've heard from end users that we surveyed across a few of our reports, one of which is our most recent Veeam Data Protection Trends Report for 2023, which surveyed 4,200 IT leaders from around the world. And in that, there was three kind of trends I wanted to highlight. The first is that when we're thinking about backup, a lot of our conversations reside around how backup is different as workloads refactor and move to different locations and different types of structures. So of course, as a lot of workloads move to the cloud, we're really trying to figure out who is backing up and what does backup mean to you. So these first two stats really speak to that kind of open question. We're really pleased to say that the vast majority of organizations are currently backing up their cloud hosted data. And we're going to talk more about the different terminology that gets thrown around, a lot of the buzzwords that get thrown around: high availability, business continuity. What does that mean? But at its core, at its most boiled down form, it's really heartening, I think, to see that organizations are backing up their cloud hosted data. They're not just resting on the laurels, assuming that something like Azure or M365 has high availability and is therefore resilient. So we don't have to have a conversation anymore about, are you backing up? Now it's about, how are you backing up and how is it good enough for what you're up against? And unfortunately, what we're finding is that when we say, are you backing up? The answer is yes. The next question is, how are you backing up? And the vast majority of organizations are just resting on scheduling snapshots. So for those of you who may be really familiar with the data center and, the kind of conversations around backup there, snapshots are an excellent part of a recovery strategy. They have very low recovery point objectives, recovery time objectives. So you're able to easily mount something and get going fast. But there's a lot of limitations around snapshots, whether it's in the data center or in the cloud. And a lot of those limitations, of course, center on cost. And that's something that Sebastian and I spent a lot of time talking about. But the one that's really top of mind for us today on this planning session is around cybersecurity. And that's because it's really not taking advantage of a lot of the security, compliance, identity, and access management options that are available to end users, simply because it's just a snapshot that's just sitting there. And it's not taking advantage of all of the amazing things that Microsoft and vendors like Veeam can provide. And that's really an imperative right now, because in our surveys over the last several years, we ask every organization, have you suffered a ransomware attack in the last year? And this isn't just, hey, did somebody try to attack you, but was there a successful attack? And the answer is yes. The vast majority of organizations do suffer at least one ransomware attack. So it's not a matter of if, but when, and what does that resiliency strategy look like? So now that we have some top of mind kind of trends that are going on across organizations like you, let's talk a little bit about some of those buzzwords that get thrown around, the synergies and thingies that we like to talk about. But let's maybe break it down into, some real world terminology that makes a little more sense. So a lot of the times when we're looking at uptime and availability, we talk about high availability. And when I look at something like the Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework and their definition of high availability, they really define it as, looking at the distribution of applications and workloads across, and this is the operative word, redundant physical, virtual, or cloud infrastructures. We already know that the beauty of using something like Microsoft Azure versus running on premises is the redundancy across their various data centers. And it's so built in. Yes, there's areas to optimize and reduce cost, but at the end of the day, I think the confidence interval is so much higher from an uptime and availability perspective on cloud infrastructure than it would be on premises. And same thing goes for disaster recovery. So again, when I'm looking at the Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework, they talk about disaster recovery as a combination of tools, backups, and especially replication technology in order to recover workloads at scale during a catastrophic event. Catastrophic events don't necessarily happen in the cloud at the rate that they do on premises. So that's once again a really nice benefit of the cloud. But as you start getting down into some of these other buzzwords that get thrown around, that's where things start to get interesting. So when we look at, again, the definition of business continuity, it's all about the processes, tools, and architecture built around DR, high availability, to ensure uptime of critical business services. And service delivery, I think, is where things start to get really interesting because there's so many different ways that service delivery can be impacted. It's not just whether or not the infrastructure has uptime, but whether or not there's continuity of the data, of access. Even when you look at something like failing over to a different location, maybe that whole thing becomes refactored and doesn't work. So there's a lot of really interesting conversations in the market happening around business continuity. And I think that's especially true because of conversations around cyber resiliency. So when we look at cyber resiliency as a definition in the market, it's all about the plethora of ways that a cyber attack can occur and looking at shoring up all of those different steps, shoring them up continuously, which is something we're going to talk about in a second, looking at the Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework, but then also planning for the worst. And that's where the last part of this stack comes in, backup and recovery. Even if you look at classic definitions of cyber resiliency, like NIST's framework, the National Institute of Science and Technology's framework, which is, a tried and true best practice framework for the industry. The very end of everything that they recommend is a recovery strategy, because what can happen will happen. And again, our data protection trends report tells us that beautifully, that so many organizations put up all these walls and they shore up their practices and they make sure that identity and access management is least privileged as possible. But at the end of the day, if a bad actor wants to get in, they have a really good chance of getting in. So having that recovery, having something that is protected from that kind of attack, and there's so many different ways to protect, and we're going to talk a lot about the capabilities within the Veeam data platform that can help you stay resilient and be able to recover. But really considering that at every step of your infrastructure is so important. So today, as we talk about that Veeam data platform, we're going to highlight a lot of cybersecurity features that are baked in across our portfolio to give you guys ideas of things that you could implement in your own environment. And it's not just all in on certain kinds of technology. Veeam is one of the least prescriptive vendors on the market. So it really becomes about what's best for your organization, for your infrastructure, for your budget, and implementing that accordingly. So we'll talk more about that in a little bit. But what I want to do first is talk a bit more about the Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework for Microsoft Azure. I think this is a really interesting set of slides that I'm going to show you because it really reinforces this idea that Microsoft wants everybody to posture around continuous improvement. Yes, we want to speed time to value with development and applications. That's great, but we also need to think about governance and compliance and keeping stability for our organizations. And a lot of that comes down to people, process, product, the normal 3 Ps of business. So thinking about how it can be everybody's responsibility to stay resilient, how we can document processes and really be continuously improving and looking to experts for best practices. So that's ultimately, I think, what me and Sebastian want to do on this presentation is get everybody thinking about some ways that they could take some of this security posture back to their infrastructures. And so to do that, this cloud adoption framework, I think, lays it out in very layman's terms that security is a discipline you practice along your entire cloud adoption path. And I think this is meant to be a bit of a circular diagram here where, yes, you have the best laid plans. Yes, you can have a great adoption strategy, but governance and management is going to be a continuous process in order to maintain security. And I think that's especially true when we look at something like this metaphor. So again, this is from the Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework, and they talk about a tale of two structures. We at Veeam primarily work with organizations that are on their journey to implementing a hybrid cloud infrastructure. That said, we do have some customers that are kind of digital natives that are born in the cloud. And boy, would that be lovely to have designed with this optimal structure in mind from the very beginning, almost like a smart building that gets built brand new. But I think the vast majority of us don't live in that world. We don't live in a perfectly well-planned building. A lot of us are having to figure out how do we retrofit and continuously optimize with what we have. And sometimes that means compromising where we need to. But I think when we're thinking about both of these kinds of structures, it's all about security, management, governance. Design, of course, helps because things can change and evolve over time. So those are some things to kind of keep in mind as we now flip to the next part of our presentation, which is all about the Veeam data platform. So I think at Veeam, we really take it seriously that we are partners for organizations like yours to really look at how heterogeneous these environments can be, how some of them maybe were modernized 3 or 4 years ago, but trends have changed. Others, you're maybe on an 18-month migration plan for a big project. And then you probably have some servers that are sitting in a closet that are 8, 9 years old, and they're going to have to stay that way because the applications running on them just are too instantiated in the organization at this point to be able to change. So given how heterogeneous our environments are, we want to make sure that the Veeam data platform can, again, be least prescriptive and most flexible across everything that you have going on. Now, Veeam is well known in the VMware space. So if any of you have heard of Veeam before, it's probably because Veeam and VM sound very similar. But if you haven't caught up with us since, we have really dramatically expanded our Veeam data platform. We now have very mature support for Microsoft Azure, AWS, Google Cloud, Microsoft 365. We just recently launched our Salesforce solution. We're well instantiated in the Windows space and have been Hyper-V supporters for a very long time. So that's really, we have a pretty significant breadth of coverage across workloads. And it's all supported by this centralized platform that has a host of monitoring services. We have an amazing orchestration tool that also has documentation built in. So we talked earlier about how important documentation can be. Automating documentation would be a luxury for many of us. So there's lots of really great things to offer within the Veeam data platform. But the main thing to kind of keep in mind as a heartbeat as we flip over into some architecture diagrams is these 3 outcomes. We want to make sure that security is top of mind for us when we're thinking about designing these products and releasing feature updates and listening to customer concerns. Security is top of mind for us, and I think for everybody in the backup space. The second is all about recovery. And Veeam has been well known as one of the easiest tools to use for recovery. And that's because we really span the full range of recovering a snapshot all the way down to a granular restore of an individual file. We want everything to be easy and painless. And then finally, data freedom. I mentioned earlier that it's very important to us that we have a breadth of coverage across all these different kinds of workloads. But you don't have to sit here and purchase individual products with individual SKUs and individual license keys. You actually can use something called a Veeam Universal License, and it offers entitlement of a wide variety of workloads. So let's say you're executing a cloud project right now. Maybe you're refactoring a VMware-based application and moving it into Microsoft Azure VMs. or maybe you're even lucky enough to be refactoring it into a Microsoft 365, I'm sorry, a Microsoft SQL database. That would be lovely. The Veeam license can actually carry with that workload from on-premises to the cloud. So no additional purchasing needed. And I think we can all agree not having to deal with procurement is kind of amazing. So keep all of that in mind as I turn it over to Sebastian. Sebastian and I are now going to kind of go back and forth a little bit talking about different ways that you can protect data on premises, in the cloud, in Microsoft 365, in containers, and all of the steps that you could think about implementing around security and improving your recovery. So Sebastian, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you so we can start talking about what an architecture for Veeam might look like on-prem.
Thank you, Leah, and hello to everyone. So let's take each ecosystem one by one and check what Veeam has to offer. Now, what customers already love about Veeam is that regardless of their on-premises footprint or flavors, either it's virtual,
And Sebastian, I think you're on mute.
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah, Leah, actually, I hear him. So.
Okay.
So sorry about that, everyone. Sebastian's going to go ahead and fix his audio. I've pinged him on the side to let him know that we can't hear him. But in the meantime, I'll go ahead and take over so that we can keep this moving. So as I said, Veeam was really built initially on Oh, we can hear Sebastian. I'm so sorry. That's my fault then. I'll go ahead and stop talking and fix my audio.
That's new. Okay, thank you, Leah. Hopefully you can hear me.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, so
go ahead.
Yeah. Okay, cool. So what I was saying is that regardless of the customer's footprints or flavors, either these are virtual, running vSphere or Microsoft Hyper-V, or they are protecting or they want to protect physical machines where they run their Windows machines, or they have specific applications that are running on those instances, Veeam Backup Entry application, which is Veeam's flagship product, our bread and butter on which we build our brand upon, can back up all these workloads in a cost-effective and secure manner and ship this backup to a repository. Now, what do we target as a repository? We can target directly to the cloud object storage. Why? There are multiple reasons behind it. First, because maybe cloud vendors like Azure offers a durable, scalable, immutable, and cost-effective repository to store backups with different access tiers or classes. And another reason is that cloud repositories usually set the scene for the golden rule of data protection, especially for those of you who are running a hybrid environment, right? Like on-premises and cloud. And for those of you who don't know, the golden rule of data protection, on which I will refer multiple times during the next slides, is having 3 copies of your data onto different media, one of them offsite. So, and apart from the cloud storage where we can store our backups, we can also leverage, or we can also target the on-premises repos to store the backup data there as well. And here is where Veeam's scale-out backup repository comes into play. Now, for those who are new to Veeam, the Veeam scale-out backup repository is a repository system with horizontal scaling support for multi-tier storage of data. Now, this first tier, and the first tier is the performance tier, which, as the name suggests, is the level used to access your data as fast as possible. Either it's from DAS, dedupe applications, or warm storage. I don't care, I want my data fast. The second tier is the capacity tier that extends the performance tier by transporting the data to the capacity tier for long-term retention. And this tier may come handy when, for example, you are either running out of storage space in the performance tier, as this is a use case that usually happens for customers that generate a large amount of data on a daily basis. And last but not least, we have the archive tier that again now extends the capacity tier. And this is perfect for scenarios where, for example, you have a lot of rarely accessed data that can be stored on an archive. Leah, is there anything else you wish to add here?
We got some questions in the Q&A that I'm going to go ahead and hang tight for. But one of those questions was around cost and complexity trade-offs of security. So we'll come back to this diagram, folks, to kind of answer that question once we get to the Q&A part. But keep in mind this sort of storage construct that there's a performance tier, capacity tier, and archive tier. And for anybody who's worked with Azure Blob or Amazon before, You know that there are cost tiers associated with each of those, but notice the lock button across. So we'll talk more about this later when we go to the Q&A, but this is a good one to keep in mind.
Okay, very clear. Now, so we can protect on-premises architectures and store these backups, let's say either to cloud or to on-premises, but sometimes this is not enough, especially if your business requirements or you have security regulations in your industry that impose keeping some of these backup copies spread across different cloud or tiers, or have multiple sites on-prem, right? Why is that? Because, okay, first, due to the security regulations, always remember the 3-to-1 rule, but also just to push that cost effectiveness to its limits. So a common use case, especially for customers that ship their backups data directly to cloud storage, is to copy the data from the standard tiers like the Azure Hot and Cool access tiers to the archive one. But what if I'm not leveraging cloud as well? Now, today, also, many industries still rely on tape to keep backups with long-term retention. So if, for example, in order to be compliant, I need to keep the archival data for 99 years in an air-gapped ecosystem that doesn't have an IP address associated to it, backup tape can be your perfect fit. Now, the question comes, what do we do with these backups? We keep them untouched in a glass house and wait for the DR to strike? No, we believe that maybe you are missing an opportunity to leverage your own backup data. And at the end of the day, it's your investment to further enable other parts of your business. And with Veeam Data Labs, we offer you the ability to use the backup data to run a copy of your instances in an isolated network to perform any outside task outside of your production environment. And why is this valuable? Because, for example, you can provide the self-service for your developers to spin copies of your data as they design new features, or maybe they they might create, let's say, a sandbox environment for their IT operations to test new patches and updates before these are rolled out to the production system. Leah, any thoughts that I've missed?
Absolutely. I think that Veeam Data Labs is a really underutilized feature, and that's common, right? Nobody can ever use all of the features within a tool that they buy. The best we hope for is that it's not shelfware. But with Veeam Data Labs, I just can't sing the praises enough of this feature. There's so many different ways that can be used, whether it is for dev test purposes or maybe you're doing DR testing. Something that we don't have on this diagram that I wanted to call out for the folks that maybe use Microsoft Defender. We also have a feature of Veeam Data Labs called Secure Restore. And it is a way that you can mount a backup and then scan it using one of several different security softwares. And so in particular, we integrate with Microsoft Defender. And that's a way that you can scan the backup to see if it's been infected by ransomware, and then know with confidence that you can mount that and push it to production before, reinfecting your environment, obviously. So that was one that I wanted to call out. That's pretty cool, especially for folks that maybe use Microsoft Defender. But overall, Veeam Data Labs, I think, is a really, really amazing tool set that I hope folks use.
Okay, cool. Very, very nice points. Now, time has come to restore the data, right? So we need to figure out where do we restore it and what are our options. So we can restore the data to cloud, either to as an EC2 instance, let's say, or Azure VM or Google Compute instances. This is a common use case, not only when you leverage the cloud as your DR site, but also during migration procedures from on-premises to cloud, right? Or we can restore the data back to on-premises. Now, what about the restore options? Now, what is the point of having multiple copies of your data if I can't restore them exactly as I want them to be? Well, I won't go into details as we can talk about restore options for days, but Veeam offers no less than 105 recovery scenarios. Okay, and only one thing is that a very important feature is Veeam's famous instant VM recovery capabilities, where you can, for example, recover immediately different workloads. Either these are VMs, EC2 instances, physical servers, as vSpheres or Hyper-Vs in your production environment by running them directly from the compressed and the duplication backup files. So we are able to launch VMs directly from the repository itself. And last but not least, okay, we always want to keep an eye on the backups, as we want to monitor everything from start to finish by offering a real-time monitoring. And here we offer you the ability to monitor the state of the VMs as they are performed, or by generating reports for capacity planning and upgrade purposes, or let's say by providing management teams with transparent and granular views of the virtual infrastructures from a business-oriented perspective. But now we have more and more customers saying, okay, Veeam, what you do on premises is cool, but how do I protect my Azure workloads? Well, for customers that are looking to protect workloads within the Azure ecosystem, Veeam has developed a cloud-native engine called Veeam Backup for Microsoft Azure that allows you to protect Azure VMs, Azure SQL databases, and Azure file shares. Now, whether your workloads are spread across multiple Azure tenants or subscriptions, the engine will usually be deployed in a tenant or subscription that is isolated from your production workloads. Why? Because we don't want to keep the backup data in the same subscription where the production workloads are. And we create cloud-native snapshots of virtual disks that are attached to the processed Azure VMs. So by creating cloud-native snapshots for Azure VMs, we are matching the vendor's capabilities in terms of data protection. But we take this step one step further. And based on those disk snapshots, the engine will automatically launch a proxy VM instance that we call worker in the same region where the process VM resides. And we read the data from the virtual disk on the worker instance. Now, what this means is that the worker will dissect the snapshot, compress it, it encrypts the data in the Veeam native format. We make it platform agnostic, and we transfer it to the Azure backup repository. And once this process is completed, the worker instance is automatically terminated and is no longer sitting in your Azure account. For Azure SQL, we follow the exact same pattern. The appliance or the engine can create a copy of the source database on a staging server. Yes, this step is optional, as we can back up the source data directly. However, we do recommend using a staging server just to have that database consistency. And then we extract the data from the staging server into a backpack file with all the database schema, the indexes, the data. And then we ship it to an Azure storage account, leveraging again the hot, cool, or the archive tiers. And last but not least, we can also perform backups of Azure file shares by creating indexed cloud-native snapshots. So why, in this case, why Veeam? Okay, why rely also on cloud-native snapshots, but also on immutable backups? Because we are matching the vendor's capabilities by creating the same cloud-native snapshots, but on top of it, we provide cost control on your cloud backups by compressing them. We target a compression between 40 and 50%. And we not only encrypt the data itself, but we encrypt also the repository using a plain password or the Azure keys. We can leverage the object lock capabilities at the container level just to have that immutability. And our backups are platform agnostic, meaning you will be able to restore these backups within your Azure ecosystem, but also outside, either on-prem or to another cloud vendor. Now, in terms of restore options to Azure, the engine allows everyone to perform a full Azure VM restore back to the original or to a new location, only volume restores. It also offers the possibility to do a fileable recovery, only if you need a couple of files, a couple of folders that you will need to restore. In terms of databases, you will be able to restore that database back to the original or to a new location within your Azure ecosystem. And for file shares, we enable users to do a fileable recovery. But what else we can do? we can take those backups from the Azure storage accounts. We can integrate with Veeam Backup and Replication, again, Veeam's flagship product, and we can either create backup copy jobs to other clouds or to on-prem. Again, why? Just to have that, keep in mind always the 3-to-1 rule. Have 3 copies of your data onto different media, one of them outside. And because our backups are platform agnostic, we allow customers to restore that data outside Azure. Okay, always remember that cloud native snapshots are not compressed and are not platform agnostic. So, for example, we allow customers to have that Azure VM and to restore it as an EC2 instance within AWS or as a VM on premises. Leah, would you like to cover the Microsoft 365 bit?
Absolutely.
I?
So, I think that you've probably seen that there's a really similar DNA across a lot of different infrastructures that the Veeam data platform protects. So Microsoft 365 will seem very similar. So I'll try not to repeat things, but in essence, Veeam Backup for Microsoft 365 protects Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, OneDrive for Business, Microsoft Teams, as well as Exchange and SharePoint on premises. So you really get a unified backup and recovery strategy for those applications overall. And again, the great thing is that you can utilize the object storage strategy, the construct that you've seen across the other kinds of infrastructures that we've covered. And that's a really popular option, especially so that you can take advantage of some of those security features like immutable backups. So again, the way that this construct would work is you would back up into an object storage support, tier that out accordingly using immutability. And then the beautiful thing about how flexible the recovery options are is you can really select via wizard-driven protocols, getting very granular how you want to recover, especially for certain purposes. So for something like a legal hold or discovery, this is a really great tool set to be able to drill nice and down into it. There's also self-service options as well, and that's new for Veeam Backup for Microsoft 365 version 7. So for those of you who are in large-scale environments who think, yeah, recovery is great, but my goodness, do I not want to sit here and recover individual emails for each person? There's some really great self-service options available that won't break anything. It'll just give them the least privileged access to the information that they need to execute a recovery. And then again, as Sebastian said, so much of the monitoring that it takes to have a lot of the governance and compliance and overall management and oversight that we talked about earlier in the presentation with the with the Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework. So how can you get that morning cup of coffee at a glance dashboard? How can you do regular reporting so that you feel confident that you are compliant? And how can you get alerts so that you can rectify any kind of backup copy job failure throughout this process? That Veeam DNA exists across on-premises, in the cloud, M365, and oftentimes uses the same tool sets as well. So Veeam 1 is our main monitoring tool, and that becomes that central point for so many different pieces of infrastructure. Now, something that's a bit different is a unique solution that we have called Kasten. So for those who don't know, the container space is really a very interesting area that a lot of organizations are really asking us to develop into. So we acquired a company called Kasten a few years ago, and we've been integrating their solutions into the Veeam data platform while allowing them to exist in the unique space that they live in, because containers are quite different. So when you think about containers, overall, it's all about how can you make sure that you're getting out of the way of developers who live in container land, while enabling them with the overall management, as well as the portability that they often need. So whether that be using something like a backup in order to port from one kind of container to another, offering blueprints to make that process easier, querying data so that you can easily access metadata, especially as so many of these apps are unstructured or in various degrees of development, that metadata piece can be really huge. And then overall, again, that oversight piece of operational support. So how can there be that monitoring and alerting, integration with authentication systems? That's really what Kasten is all about, is enabling the folks who work in containers to do what they do best while still having that governance, compliance, portability, oversight that is so important to infrastructure teams overall. So overall, the Kasten platform is, as I said, quite different, as it should be, because containers are quite different. But there are some similar constructs in mind, especially in the Microsoft space. So Kasten does play with Azure Kubernetes Services, AKS. And it also has several other integration points with Microsoft services like key management, in addition to blob storage. So you're able to really scale that storage and try to keep some of those costs down, which I know has been a little bit of a, kind of set of topics around the Q&A portion, which I think is where we will head to next. So with that, I'll keep Sebastian on the line with me here, and let's talk a little bit about some questions that have popped in. So one of the questions I referenced earlier was from Lynn, asking, do you have any advice for organizations trying to consider the cost and complexity trade-off of implementing security solutions across the Microsoft ecosystem? And I think that's a lot of what that Microsoft Cloud Adoption Framework talks about, is that balancing scale, because it's never going to be perfect, but at least we can try to shore things up where it makes sense. But I think a lot of the goal that we have as a Veeam team is to try to, yes, reduce those complexities, but also reduce cost. So throughout a lot of these diagrams, you saw constructs around storage management. So how can we tier things out to hot storage, cool storage, archive storage, or even exfiltrate entirely from the cloud and back up to something like tape? There's a term that I probably should have thrown earlier in my sort of buzzword soup slide called WORM, write once, read many. And that's a lot of the construct principle that we have around our blob storage, but also with tape. When you look at worm storage, that's a really great way to reduce the cost, because the provider, whether it's tape or cloud object storage, they're really thinking about how can they drive down networking costs and storage costs as much as possible with some of these options. And just being able to write once is a lot of the way to drive that complexity down. And again, tag that with that immutability function that's built into Azure Blob, or in the case of tape, that's naturally air-gapped. All of that will give you that security and resiliency to be able to recover in the face of anything. So that's a really great way to maybe think about it. And then another way to drive down a lot of those complexities is to look for vendors who have a lot of built-in integrations. We're very proud here at Veeam to have a lot of available RESTful APIs. We have an instantiated PowerShell story as well, but we also really pride ourselves on having close relationships with vendors throughout the ecosystem to develop together and have built-in integrations that are already in the workflow, so you don't have to do that work. And we have a really tremendous partnership with Microsoft. We have so many different integration points and so many places that we develop together that I think we're trying to find ways to reduce that complexity for our joint end users. So that would be kind of two pieces of advice that we would have, is really think about how you can drive down storage costs while turning on immutability, but then also looking for vendors overall that integrate for you, as opposed to just saying, but APIs, because I think that it's great to have APIs, but having a lot of those built-in things will reduce the complexity overall. So that's how I think we would address that question. We also had another question: can this process be used both on-prem and in the cloud? And I think that was probably early in the presentation, referring to the Cloud Adoption Framework. And I do think that it could apply. I think that Microsoft really considered the Cloud Adoption Framework as a hybrid cloud solution. Microsoft, I think overall, really considers their organizations to be hybrid. It's very rare that an organization is completely all in on the cloud for a variety of reasons. So I think that a lot of those constructs apply when you're thinking about management and governance and having that be a continuous motion. So I think it's just good rules to have. We had another question asking about system requirements for development. I talked a lot about documentation and how important documentation is. Veeam has a help center where all of our user guides are available and updated regularly across all of the different tool sets. And within each of those user guides, there are system requirements available. Of course, the nice thing about using something like the cloud is continuous versioning. So that reduces your system's requirement burden, if you will. But especially for the on-premises piece, I really recommend taking a look at the Veeam user guides. That's enough of me talking. Sebastian, I wanted to poach a couple of questions to you. I think somebody saw in this question here, a note on one of our diagrams talking about hardened repositories. We've spent a lot of time, Sebastian, talking about Microsoft technologies, but this may be a good time to talk a little bit about hardened repositories, because the question is, what does the hardened repository run on? So can you maybe address that, Sebastian?
So is the question related to the repositories from the Azure ecosystem? So within Azure, we store the...
I think it's actually on the VBR one. So if I remember right, earlier we had a diagram that had a Veeam hardened repository on it. So I'll go ahead and take this one actually, because I think I can address it. So there was a piece of a diagram called hardened repository, and that refers to our Linux hardened repository. There are so many different ways to think about having a recoverable backup stored in your infrastructure. We've spent a lot of time talking about Azure Blob with that immutability check. We've talked about tape and how great of an option that can still be. I don't think tape will ever die. But one of the newer features that we have available is the hardened repository. And that is a feature that runs on Linux. Everybody loves a good freeware solution. And it's a really, really popular feature that folks are adopting to add to their immutability story. So especially if you're running on premises, the hardened repository could be a great option if tape maybe isn't the right recovery strategy for that workload. And maybe you don't necessarily want to use blob storage. Maybe it doesn't make sense for that server because it's in a robo, or you're in a place where networking can be a little tough to manage. Hardened repository could be a really great solution. So if you Google Veeam hardened repository Linux, there will be a lot more information on that feature. And that's just yet another security, recoverability, resiliency feature that Veeam has. So I think that would be really cool.
Yeah. Great point, Leah.
Absolutely. Sebastian, are you seeing any other questions that you'd want to address?
And
if not, I think we can hand it back to Scott.
Okay, I do.
Okay. No, go ahead, Sebastian.
I do see one other question that I've also replied into the chat window. So does Veeam help us delegate access control within your IT team? Definitely, yeah. So across all the platforms that we have to protect either on-premises, cloud, and Office 365, we do leverage the role-based access control, where we can set specific privileges and permissions to different types of users and to grant access within our products to certain features, but not only, but also to specific areas and specific workloads that the customer is allowed to see, visualize, backup, or to the restores. And again, this functionality is across all our products.
Fantastic. I think that we didn't talk a lot about identity and access management, but that role-based access control is a really great way to implement least privilege access protocols. So I'm glad that question got asked. Awesome. Okay, great. Well, Scott, I think maybe that's all the questions that we can address here. We'll stay on the chat, but do you want to maybe flip it over to do some closing thoughts?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So thanks, Leah, and thanks, Sebastian. Great stuff. Really informative presentation. I've got to say, I took a screen grab of that slide about 105 recovery scenarios. It was really a great slide, just because there are so many different ways to recover, and so many different environments to recover out of, and it was really, really nice to see those all in one place. But tremendous stuff today. And before we wrap up, we do have one final piece of business. It is the Amazon gift card prize drawing. And the winner of that $250 Amazon gift card is Dan McPherson from California. So congratulations to Dan. We'll be in touch to get you your card. And with that, on behalf of the Actual Tech Media team, I want to thank Leah and Sebastian and Veeam for making this event possible. And thanks, as always, for attending and for your great questions during the event. That concludes today's event. Have a fantastic rest of your day.